Hey, my name is Steve Rathje. I am a psychology PhD student at the University of Cambridge, and I'm going to be talking about how accuracy and social incentives shape belief in misinformation. So some quick background. A lot of prior work has shown that people are much more likely to believe in and share politically congruent news as opposed to politically incongruent news. And this effect might seem intuitive, but it's not actually obvious why this is happening. So why is there a partisan bias in belief in true and fake news? One common explanation is that people are engaging in politically motivated reasoning. So because people want something to be true, they are likely to reason their way into believing it is true. However, there are a lot of critics of the politically motivated reasoning perspective who suggest that partisan differences in belief in true and false news could just be due to people having different prior beliefs. So, for example, Democrats and Republicans are in echo chambers. They're exposed to very different media sources and thus may reasonably have very different beliefs about things happening in the world. And because a lot of experiments don't causally manipulate people's motivations, it is hard to disentangle these two explanations. So we wanted to set out to see whether partisan differences in belief in misinformation are due to different motivations versus genuinely different factual beliefs. And to do this, we experimentally manipulated people's motivations to be accurate or people's motivations to see things through a partisan lens. And how did we do this? Well, we use money. We wanted to see whether we could pay people to better spot fake news and to discern it from true news. Now, we aren't the first people to use this paradigm, which has been popular amongst political scientists as well as economists. For instance, past research has found that financial incentives to be accurate can reduce polarized perceptions of the economy. So, for example, Democrats are more likely to say that the economy is better under Republicans if they are given money to be accurate. However, we don't know how accuracy incentives shape our belief in political news. So that's what we set out to test. So here are the methods behind our studies. So for study one, we recruited a politically balanced sample, half Democrat, half Republican, online, and we randomly assigned people to two conditions, the accuracy incentives condition and the control condition. And we had people look at 16 pre-tested true and false news articles that have been used in prior studies. And our main dependent variables were the perceived accuracy of the articles and how likely the participant would be to share each of the articles. So here are some example stimuli. So as you can see, we balanced the stimuli. So we had an equal number of true Republican-leaning articles, true Democrat-leaning articles, false Democrat-leaning articles, false Republican-leaning articles. And these are all real fake and true news articles that have been in the world. So this is what the experiment looked like to the participants. So this is the control condition. People were asked how accurate is the above headline and how likely they would be to share the above headline. But in the accuracy treatment, people were told at the beginning that they would receive a financial incentive of up to $1 based on how accurate their responses were to the accuracy question. And they would receive this little notice before answering every question about accuracy, just reminding them that their answers would contribute to a bonus payment. The sharing question was not incentivized, so people's bonus payments were not affected by the sharing question. So our hypotheses were that accuracy incentives would improve truth discernment, which is belief in true claims minus belief in false claims. We also thought that the accuracy incentives would reduce partisan bias, which is belief in politically congruent claims minus belief in politically incongruent claims. In other words, we thought people would become more politically balanced. So what were our results? Well, as predicted, we found that accuracy incentives did indeed improve truth discernment, and they also decrease partisan bias. And while these effects might seem small at first glance, this actually equated to a 46% decrease in partisan bias, which shows us that a fair amount of people's partisan gap in belief in political news isn't just due to different genuinely factual beliefs, but the amount of effort people put in to trying to accurately answer the question. Now, when we broke down the results by headline type, we actually received some pretty interesting and surprising results. So this effect was almost entirely driven by an increased belief in politically incongruent true news. So this is, for example, Republicans, when they are paid to be accurate, would be more likely to say that articles from CNN or the Washington Post are accurate, whereas Democrats would be more likely to say that articles from news outlets such as Fox News are accurate. So we found no effect for fake news and no effect for politically congruent true news. We also found a small effect such that giving people these accuracy incentives also improved people's sharing decisions such that they shared more true articles and less false articles. Now, this question wasn't incentivized, so this suggests that people's incentives to think about articles in a more accurate way actually spilled over into their sharing decisions, which was quite interesting. Now, for study 2, we set out to replicate and extend upon these effects. So we recruited about 1,000 participants, once again, politically balanced, and we randomly assigned them to 4 conditions. So as in study 1, we had an accuracy incentives condition and a control condition, but we also added a social incentives condition and a mixed incentives condition. So in the social incentives condition, people were given a financial incentive to identify articles that would be liked by one's political in-group. And in the mixed incentive condition, people receive both a financial incentive to answer questions accurately and an additional financial incentive to correctly identify articles that would be liked by one's political in-group. So I'll show you examples on the next page of what this looked like for participants. So this is a social incentives condition. People would be asked at the beginning whether they are a Republican or Democrat, and then they would be asked to correctly identify whether this article would receive a positive reaction from Democrats if they were a Democrat and Republicans if they are Republican, if they were to share this article on social media. So this aimed to mirror the incentives of social media, where people are thinking about how many likes and shares they will receive if they are to share an article online. And then immediately after, people were asked about accuracy and how likely they would be to share the article. Now, in the mixed incentives condition, people were given this social incentive, and then immediately after, they were also told that they would receive an incentive, that they would receive a bonus payment based on how accurately they answered questions about the veracity of the articles. So we thought in the mixed incentives condition that perhaps the effect of the accuracy incentive would be reduced if people were thinking a lot about their partisan identity and were rewarded for thinking about their partisan identity. So what were our results? So we replicated the results from study 1 such that truth discernment was improved in the accuracy incentives condition. The social incentives condition did not differ from the control condition. And the mixed incentives condition also did not differ from the control condition. So this supports our hypothesis that when people are given an accuracy incentive, but they're also given an incentive to think in terms of their partisan identity, that thinking in terms of their partisan identity can reduce this accuracy motivation, or perhaps distract from people's motivation to be accurate. And we found quite similar effects for partisan bias. However, some of these effects were marginally significant after adjusting for multiple comparisons. And then when we broke down results by headline type, we received very similar results. So once again, this effect was almost entirely driven by an increased belief in politically incongruent true articles. And this was a relatively large effect size. Once again, we found no effect on the false news items and basically no effect on the politically congruent true news items. Now, when we looked at the sharing condition, the results are quite interesting. So we did not replicate the effect from study 1, which was a small effect in study 1, such that the accuracy incentives condition improved sharing discernment. However, we found that both in the social incentives condition and the mixed incentives conditions, so in both of these conditions, people were incentivized to think about their partisan identity. We found that people shared more politically congruent articles, whether these articles were true or false. And this was whether or not the accuracy incentive was present. So this result is quite interesting and perhaps a little worrisome that when you have people thinking about their partisan identity, they will share more articles that match their partisan identity, regardless of the veracity of those articles. Were there ideological asymmetries in our effect? So we did not find a significant interaction between partisan identity and the strength of the effect. However, descriptively, we found a slight trend such that the effect seemed to be present for both Republicans and Democrats, but seemed to be ever so slightly larger for Republicans, which we thought was quite interesting because this differed from other results by other scholars in the field. For instance, other scholars have proposed this intervention called an accuracy nudge, in which you just subtly prime the idea of thinking about accuracy. And while this intervention might seem superficially similar to our intervention, it has actually quite different results. So this intervention tends to work much better for Democrats and has a small or negligible effect size for Republicans. However, we see the opposite pattern in our research, such that we find a bigger effect size for Republicans. So I think this suggests that there is a difference between just having people pay attention to the concept of accuracy versus giving people an actual motivation to be accurate and having people potentially override their partisan motivations. So were these results due to expressive responding? So one interpretation of our results is that when people are filling out surveys, especially strong partisans might engage in something known as partisan cheerleading or expressive responding. In other words, they will just respond in a way that matches their partisan identity, even though they are purposely giving false answers to the questions. We asked people a few questions to see if they were engaging in expressive responding, and we found limited evidence for this hypothesis. So only 2% of participants in the accuracy incentives condition said they were answering in a way that did not reflect their true beliefs just to get money. And only 5% of participants admitted to purposefully giving the wrong answer in order to express support for their own party. So at least when directly asking people, people did not seem to consciously report engaging in expressive responding. So we think that the more likely interpretation is that when you give someone an accuracy incentive, it increases their motivation and therefore their effort toward giving the correct answer, and it reduces their motivation to answer in a partisan focused way. So what are the implications of this research? So we found that belief in political news is not just due to people's different prior beliefs, but can be shaped by people's motivations to be accurate or to think in a partisan way. Incentives to be accurate can improve truth discernment, and they can reduce partisan bias by as much as 46%, suggesting that a fair amount of partisan bias isn't just due to different factual beliefs about the world. However, focusing on partisan motivations can cancel out the effect of accuracy incentives. So while we think that interventions, perhaps by technology companies or interventions that can be deployed at scale on social media, should focus on instilling an accuracy motivation and should focus on people's motivations, We think these interventions might also be practically difficult in a social media context where there are such strong incentives and motivations, where the entire social media design structure is almost exclusively based around this motivation to receive likes and shares by people mostly in your in-group, and to share articles that might match your partisan identity. So this points to potential challenges of instilling an accuracy motivation in a social media context. There are a lot of outstanding questions from our research. So for example, why do incentives only impact belief in true articles? This was a somewhat surprising result, but we have a few hypotheses. So for instance, true news might just simply be more believable, and perhaps just a small amount of people believe in fake news anyway. Another hypothesis is that people are responding to source cues and have very strong opinions and associations with partisan news outlets like Fox News or news outlets like CNN or the New York Times. So think of Donald Trump saying to a CNN reporter, "You are fake news." A lot of partisans will dismiss perspectives coming from the other side as fake news. However, our research suggests that this might be due in part to motivated reasoning or expressive responding, and that this tendency can be reduced through instilling an accuracy motivation. So for study 3, which we are currently planning, we intend to do a replication of these findings. However, we will show people these headlines with or without source cues to see if our effects are driven by source cues. I'd like to give a huge thank you to my advisors and co-authors, Dr. Sander van der Linden of the University of Cambridge and Dr. Jay Van Bavel of New York University. Please reach out to me if you have any thoughts, feedback, questions, or would like to speak more. My email is here. Thank you very much.